Throughout history, many great figures have left a profound impact on human civilization, from brilliant leaders and exceptional scientists to visionary thinkers. They have helped shape the world as we know it today. The man known to history as the Marquis de Lafayette was born on the 6th of September 1757 in the Château of Chavagnac in the province of Auvergne in southern France. His father was Michel Louis Christophe Roche Gilbert Paulette de Mortier, Marquis de Lafayette, and his mother was Marie-Louise Joly de la Rivière. Lafayette's full name was Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roche Gilbert de Mortier de Lafayette, though to his close family members he was known simply as Gilbert. He came of age and made his mark on the world during the Age of Revolutions, a period of time between the 1770s and the mid-1800s, in which multiple revolutions, including the American, French, and Haitian revolutions, rocked the globe and transformed the way in which humans lived and interacted with each other. It was indeed a world turned upside down. Lafayette played a direct role in two of these revolutions, the American and the French, becoming a national hero in both the United States and France. Whether it was on the battlefield or in the stateroom, Lafayette was a man destined to transform history. Lafayette's parents were from the lower nobility. Their family and region were poor and underdeveloped, though family legends told of their ancestors' greatness and valor on the field of battle. Lafayette's father was a grenadier. The grenadiers were special soldiers recruited for their strength and talent. Previous generations were those that would throw crude grenades into enemy fortifications, though the practice was already dying out by the 1750s when Michel was at war. Michel was a colonel in the Royal Army and was sent at the time of Lafayette's birth to fight in what is now Germany. In the mid-1700s, the territories of modern Germany were a loose collection of states and provinces. They also were the site of countless battles and wars as various empires fought to control the valuable resources of the region. Michel likely learned through letter of the birth of his son, a cause for celebration in a society that placed the entire family fortunes on the eldest living male relative. Michel perhaps felt elation, knowing that now his family estate was secured for future generations. Michel was part of the French army under the command of Louis de Conrad, the Marshal of France, that was gaining more and more territory in Germany during the 7 Years' War, a major worldwide conflict that pitted France against Great Britain and her German allies. The French had successfully captured the fortress of Minden, and thinking that they had their enemies defeated, marched to finish them off. The battle was a disaster for the French, their cavalry unable to crush the British infantry line. During the battle, Michel was killed by a British cannonball, leaving the young Lafayette fatherless. The death of her husband perhaps had a devastating impact on Lafayette's mother, Marie. Marie left her family and moved to Paris, only returning during the summer months until her death in 1770. One historian argues that Lafayette was left in the care of his maternal grandmother, Madame de Chavagnac. She was a woman who believed in the importance of her family and its potential for greatness. Strict but kindly, Madame de Chavagnac governed the manor and town effectively and with little fanfare. She tolerated her grandson playing with peasant children and showed little interest in the social life of France's royals. It was with his grandmother that Lafayette learned his first life lessons in the rural atmosphere of Auvergne, France. Though tutored by a French Jesuit and by an intellectual named Abbé Fayon, most of his time was spent in the outdoors on his family's estate. More than anything, Lafayette dreamed of military accomplishment and glory, just like his ancestors. His grandmother's stories had fed the flames of chivalry in the young boy, and he was eager to prove his worth to the Kingdom of France and build up the glory of the Lafayette name. However, his time in the countryside was ended when his mother, Marie, brought him to live with her and her father, the Marquis de la Rivière, a powerful man in the court of Louis XV and a commander of the Black Musketeers, the king's personal horse guard. There, Marie looked to initiate Lafayette into the world of aristocracy and social graces. He was sent to school, and he began attending balls. Almost 2 years after his arrival in Paris, Lafayette's mother died of a fatal illness on April 3rd, soon to be followed by her father, the Marquis de la Rivière, on April 24th, 1770. Lafayette was now an orphan at the age of 13, and left with a tremendous fortune of 120,000 livres, making him one of the richest people in France. Devastated, the young Lafayette now had to depend on outside counselors for help navigating the swamp of royal politics. After the death of his mother and grandfather, Lafayette faced a choice: to return to the family manor or to continue his education. The ambitious young man chose to remain in Paris, continuing his studies and beginning training as a king's musketeer. Although his summers were spent at Chavagnac, Lafayette was determined to rise in France and was already making great strides to do so. Social climbing in France almost always required marriage. Marriage in elite circles was for the purpose of building up family connections, titles, and wealth. One of the first families to begin vying for the young Lafayette was the Duke of Dayard, Jean-Paul François de Norly, a powerful family in the French aristocracy and well connected to the royal family, who invited Lafayette to get to know the family, and in particular their second daughter, Adrienne. The match made perfect sense to Lafayette, and to the joy of both families, Lafayette married Adrienne on April the 11th, 1774. Lafayette was 16 years old. His bride, Adrienne, was 14. Though begun as a marriage of convenience, love developed between the two as they grew together, and as Lafayette advanced in the world. Adrienne became a strong advocate for Lafayette and tirelessly supported her husband in his many ventures. She also reared their children, while Lafayette played the role of an absentee father. The marriage also provided Lafayette with political capital and a way to rise through the French military. His father-in-law placed him in the Noailles Dragoons, a prestigious military group, perfect for an ambitious young Frenchman wishing to make a name for himself. However, for the next 2 years, Lafayette first and foremost sought to prove himself as an elite gentleman of the French court, attempting to master skills such as horsemanship, diplomacy, and even, distastefully, the art of taking a mistress. During the years prior to the American Revolution, Lafayette was enveloped in the intrigues of court, seeking to win the affections of Aglaé Dunostein, a woman known for her charm and prestigious connections. He failed miserably, though succeeding perhaps in wounding the heart of his devoted and faithful young wife. Though his father-in-law himself played similar court games as his son-in-law, Noailles wanted to drill some discipline into what he perceived to be a reckless youth. Thus, in 1776, Lafayette found himself in the town of Metz, a city in northeast France. It was here that Lafayette began hearing about a distant conflict in America between Britain and her colonies. Lafayette, eager to enact revenge on the people who killed his father, was immediately intrigued. Lafayette began studying everything he could about America. A 19-year-old gifted with an active mind and willingness to learn, Lafayette was initiated into the Freemasons, a covert fraternity which at the time espoused chivalric ideals. There he came into greater contact with other sympathizers of the American revolutionaries. Seeking his father-in-law's help in aiding the Americans, Lafayette was instead counseled to wait and let men of lesser fortunes risk it on the Americans. Lafayette, whose bitterness towards the British and acceptance of Enlightenment philosophies of liberty and natural law, was undeterred. He, along with hundreds of other adventurous young European soldiers, believed that America was a backwater that needed professional help. King Louis XVI forbade Lafayette and his co-conspirators to go to America, fearing that any premature interference would result in failure for France. However, not even the king's command could stop the idealistic and headstrong youth. In the summer of 1776, just as the American Continental Congress was debating and declaring independence, Lafayette was meeting with Silas Deane, the American ambassador to France. Lafayette argued that he was prepared to help the Americans, even willing to risk his vast fortune in order to come to their aid. To the American delegate, Lafayette's offer was too good to turn down, and the young Frenchman was given a generalship in the Continental Army. Infused, Lafayette plotted his trip to America, along with a few fellow French officers. Lafayette purchased a ship named Victoire and began outfitting the vessel. While his ship was preparing itself, Lafayette traveled to London to visit Adrienne's uncle, the Marquis de Noailles, who was then ambassador to Great Britain. Visiting various political figures, including George III, the King of Great Britain, Lafayette dazzled everyone he met with his personality and wit. Little could any of the British elites he met with have imagined that the young Frenchman would soon be leading American colonists against British forces. From London, Lafayette wrote to his father-in-law, who, though supportive of the Americans, saw Lafayette's defiance of the king as foolhardy. Adding to the complexity, Adrienne was pregnant with Lafayette's second child. Noailles was furious and acted instantly to stop his son-in-law, even asking some officials to place the young man in the Bastille, the famous French prison in Paris, till Lafayette had cooled off. Undeterred, Lafayette directed his ship to the Spanish port of Los Pasajes and entered Spain in 1777, disguised as a courier. Despite further threats from the king and other nobles, Lafayette was determined to earn glory in America and return to France a hero. From May to June of 1777, Lafayette's ship made its way across the Atlantic, hoping to avoid both British military vessels and French ships. Throughout the trip, Lafayette wrote letters to his wife, informing her of the adventures he was having, never thinking much of how his disappearance could have impacted on his young pregnant wife. Lafayette instead focused on his excitement at coming to America, at becoming an American, and fighting for a cause worth dying for. Lafayette stated in one letter that the happiness of America is intimately connected with the happiness of all mankind. She will become the safe and respected asylum of virtue, integrity, toleration, equality, and tranquil happiness. Her happiness and my glory are my only incentives to the task of fighting for America. He landed in South Carolina on June the 15th, 1777, and it was here that Lafayette met his first Americans, enslaved African Americans working on gathering oysters. Lafayette would later become a powerful anti-slavery advocate, working constantly to convince his mentor and friend George Washington to help kill off the practice. However, at that precise moment, he had other matters on his mind, such as fighting and winning a revolution. Upon entering Charleston, Lafayette was warmly welcomed, he and his friends becoming instant celebrities in the small city. After having joined in the welcome festivities, Lafayette donated a substantial sum of money to aid the local patriots before buying a carriage for himself and his companions. But almost as soon as he had landed, he was off again. The restless and glory-driven heart of the young nobleman had no time to wait. He needed to get to the camp of General George Washington and to his new life as an American soldier. After several weeks of hard traveling over rough American roads, Lafayette and his small company of fellow French officers arrived in Philadelphia on July the 27th, 1777. Philadelphia was then the capital of the fledgling United States and was the largest and most economically important city in America at the time. Founded in 1682 by members of the Religious Society of Friends, more commonly known as the Quakers, the city had around 40,000 residents, making it smaller than London by roughly 700,000 people and around 500,000 less than Paris. However, despite its relatively small size, the city was well laid out and orderly, the founders of Philadelphia having used a grid pattern for the city design. Lafayette would have noticed the diversity of the city as well, with English and German settlers, both free and enslaved African Americans, and many others crowding the streets as his carriage made its way toward the home of the Massachusetts statesman John Hancock, who had helped lead the colonies towards rebellion and subsequently outright revolution. Lafayette perhaps expected to be received as a hero, but instead was afforded a lukewarm reception. From the start of the American Revolution, a flood of European adventurers had crossed the Atlantic to offer their services to the fledgling United States for high pay and high official status. Many of these men claimed higher ranks than they actually were, and the vast majority were completely incompetent. Lafayette's arrival coincided with a change in fortunes for the Americans. In the spring of 1776, the American armies in Canada had been driven back into New York by a British force led by Scotsman Guy Carleton. In New York, General William Howe had invaded, bested, and nearly wiped out the American armies commanded by George Washington. Narrowly escaping New York, Washington retreated to defend Philadelphia. Washington's army had won several crucial victories at the battles of Princeton and Trenton, thus buying the American army more time. Despite these victories, the American army was plagued by a lack of funds, food, and supplies. Americans were desperate. Hancock refused to meet Lafayette, his secretary instead sending the Frenchman and his companions to see Robert Morris, the man behind the finances of the Continental Congress. Morris likewise was dismissive and suggested that Lafayette instead confer with James Lovell, who served on the Congressional Committee of Foreign Correspondence. Meeting Lovell at the Pennsylvania State House, Lafayette was likely shocked to hear that his services would not be needed, and that the promised rank of general in the American army was not to be his. Lafayette was devastated. However, Lovell, after reviewing letters from Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane regarding Lafayette, sought out the young Frenchman and apologized for his initial hostility. Lafayette in turn expressed his willingness to serve as a simple soldier, if it meant that he could fight in the cause of freedom. Lovell was excited and intrigued by the young Frenchman, who appeared to want nothing more than to fight for his adopted country. Lovell brought Lafayette before Congress, who awarded him the status of a major general. However, he was not to command any units, and was instead to be a visitor and advisor to the American commanders already in the field. In essence, his position was honorary. Congress, eager to move to the next problem, turned the matter over to George Washington. Lafayette had his first chance of meeting the American leader on August 1, 1777 at the City Tavern in Philadelphia. There, Lafayette mingled with other American officers and elites, and was able to introduce himself to the commander. The meeting was quite successful, as Lafayette was able to impress the older Virginian planter with his sincerity and devotion to the American cause. Washington invited Lafayette to join him on an inspection of American forts along the Delaware River, a sign of acceptance by the American commander. During the inspection, Lafayette became better acquainted with the American military structure. its leading men, and the soldiers themselves. His enthusiasm earned the friendship of men such as Horatio Gates, Henry Knox, and Nathaniel Greene, all men who played a critical role in the American military. After a month of interacting with the American army stationed at Philadelphia, Lafayette had his first opportunity to prove his worth as the American forces launched an attack on the British gathering near Brandywine Creek, just a few miles distant from the American capital. Leading a group of several hundred men, Lafayette enthusiastically led his men into battle. Cannon fire, musket fire, and the shouts and screams of battle echoed across the battlefield. In the midst of the fray, Lafayette was struck by a bullet in the leg, causing him to fall from his horse. Undeterred, Lafayette continued to command until the bleeding became so intense that he was forced from the front lines. Lafayette was treated by Washington's personal doctor as the American forces retreated, after having been nearly encircled by the larger British force. Having barely turned 20, Lafayette lay wounded and was evacuated to the nearby city of Bristol. There, the young Frenchman was visited by Henry Lawrence, the President of the United States Congress, who took a personal interest in the young general and took him to a different hospital away from the conflict. Lafayette waited there for 2 months, missing the Battle of Germantown, a battle in which the Americans nearly won the day, if it had not been for a few devastating mistakes made by the inexperienced forces. The defeats at Brandywine and Germantown forced the Americans to abandon Philadelphia, allowing the British military to march triumphantly into the United States capital. Some of the Loyalists, or those Americans who supported the British Empire, openly celebrated the American defeat. Many American patriots fled the city, hoping that soon General George Washington could retake Philadelphia, though many became increasingly pessimistic at the ability of the American armies to ever be able to win the war. Throughout the colonies, the twin defeats of Brandywine and Germantown, as well as the loss of Philadelphia, cast gloom over the young nation. However, a resounding victory in New York at the Battle of Saratoga provided some solace. Though the Americans had failed in several key battles, at least they had not fully collapsed. Lafayette, who had studied military history throughout his youth, likely was intrigued to see how the American forces responded to the loss of the capital. While some men did desert the army, several thousand American soldiers marched towards a winter encampment at a place 25 miles northwest of Philadelphia, called Valley Forge. Lafayette recovered quickly from his leg wound and then rode to the American encampment at Valley Forge. Though the winter was not as devastating as some historians have portrayed, the cold and snow, combined with the lack of supplies and meager rations, made for a particularly difficult few months. Across the small valley, soldiers constructed wood huts to shelter them from the winter cold. Many soldiers decided that winter that freedom was not worth the price of their lives. However, many more remained at the winter encampment, risking their lives to maintain the American army. While there, Lafayette led a small reconnaissance mission and engaged the enemy at Haddonfield, for which he earned the commendation of American leaders for his bravery. Though the mission had been a near disaster, his successful escape and quick thinking gained him praise from those around him. Lafayette was accomplishing what he had hoped. Though he had yet to achieve a significant victory, his reputation was growing as a dashing and fearless leader. He inspired confidence in his fellow officers and subordinates, his fervor for the American cause running as deep as many Americans. While in Valley Forge, he witnessed the arrival of the fiery Baron von Steuben, a Prussian military man, who in reality was a low-ranking officer, but who began to drill into the American army the sense of order and discipline that was needed to turn the motley bunch of farmers, artisans, laborers, and seamen into a coherent fighting force. Remarkably, von Steuben found a receptive audience who quickly accepted the military training. Lafayette would have noted that this acceptance of the training stemmed in large measure from the patriotism of the soldiers. These men were not fighting for kings, for the glory of a nation, or for money or gold. At the time, Congress was heavily in debt, unable to pay its soldiers for several years. Lafayette likely would have realized that these soldiers fought for the ideals that had inspired himself to cross the Atlantic and risk his reputation, his fortunes, and his very life. The American cause of liberty, equality, and justice was the glue that held much of the army together. Lafayette believed fervently that his ragtag group could win, though when their victory would come was yet to be seen. As winter turned to spring and the cold winds coming down the Schuylkill River from the hills to the west subsided, the American army received welcome news. The French government, following the American victory of Saratoga and the near victory at Germantown, had decided to support the Americans in their fight for freedom as a way of damaging their old enemy Great Britain. Louis XVI had agreed to an alliance with the young republic, thus diverting much of Britain's strength and attention to defending its Caribbean sugar colonies from the French. Soon, French forces would be sent to America to help drive the British from the American coastlines. Celebrations were held at the News as men and officers rejoiced at the change in fortunes. Then came the opportunity that Lafayette had been dreaming of since his arrival in America: the ability to command his own army in the field of battle. Though the Americans had failed to seize Canada during the years of 1775 and 1776, many in Congress and in the American military believed that there was still sufficient support for their cause among the old French-Canadian settlers living along the Gulf of St. Lawrence. In fact, several hundred Canadians had joined the American armed forces and had participated in most of the major battles, including the battles of Brandywine, Germantown, and Saratoga. These Canadians would be assigned to Lafayette's command, as well as several thousand other American soldiers. The American command hoped that, with the alliance with France, they could receive help in retaking the old French colony of Quebec that had been seized by the British in 1763. Lafayette was ecstatic. Not only would he help the Americans by removing the threat of invasion from Canada, but he also would be able to avenge the French loss of 1763 and restore the honor of his beloved France. Arriving in Albany, New York, Lafayette discovered that the army was far smaller than promised, and that there would be little support shown for a second invasion of Canada. The lack of French support did much to kill the operation as well. Disappointed and frustrated, Lafayette found himself far from his friends in the main American army, and dealing with a disorganized and collapsing military structure in the north. Turning his energies to rebuilding the northern wing of the Continental Army, Lafayette found himself facing a formidable opponent: the Native American powers aligned with Great Britain. The indigenous peoples of North America had long posed a challenge to colonists' plans of expansion and conquest. Rather than passive victims, as they were sometimes portrayed, these tribes were groups of people who were willing to fight and contest the advancing empires. In fact, these Native American tribes were also willing to conquer and create vast empires themselves. The Iroquois or Haudenosaunee Confederacy had successfully established a powerful empire in northwestern New York State and remained a strong player in imperial ventures. On many occasions, they had played European powers off against each other and had succeeded in gaining more territory and supplies from their European enemies. Lafayette himself sought to negotiate with the Six Nations, as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was also called. For a disciple of the Enlightenment, Lafayette was infused at the opportunity to observe the native peoples of the region. He participated in negotiations and believed that he had played a successful role. Though he spent little time in northern New York, he was as busy as ever, attempting to bring success to the American cause. It was while there that Lafayette learned of a tragedy that shocked him deeply. His daughter, Henriette, had died. She was only 2 years old. Lafayette soon returned to Washington's camp and was nearly captured at the small Battle of Barren Hill outside of Philadelphia. In May of 1778, Lafayette led several thousand men almost into a trap, narrowly escaping once again. Luck seemed to constantly be on the young man's side. Lafayette was also present as a massive French fleet arrived to aid the Americans in July of 1778. However, the French commanders were timid and worried about the possibility of severe losses, recalling the brutal defeats at British hands during the 7 Years' War. It was also true that French resources were far more limited than the British Empire's. In order to win, they had to have victories without great expense. And the commander of the fleet, Comte d'Estaing, was unwilling to make any risky move for the Americans. Thankfully, their mere presence on the American coastline was enough to force the new British commander, George Clinton, to decide to evacuate from Philadelphia and retreat towards New York. Seeing an opportunity, Washington's army, which had been training throughout the winter of 1777 and 1778, attacked. Catching the rear of Clinton's army in New Jersey at a place called Monmouth Courthouse, Washington's forces showed that they had transformed themselves from a collection of citizens into an army. Surprised, the British were unable to overwhelm the Americans as in previous battles. While the battle technically was a draw, it was an incredible intellectual victory. Americans had nearly bested one of Europe's strongest empires on the field of battle. Though Lafayette and Washington were disappointed at not having captured the British forces, the battle proved to be a turning point in the war, as Clinton's army hunkered down for a long stay in New York. Meanwhile, the French forces under Comte d'Estaing continued to cause problems in the French and American alliance. The Americans felt that the French military leadership was arrogant and unwilling to work alongside the Americans, in addition to being incompetent. Lafayette worked to calm tensions. However, Americans like Washington believed that, in order to succeed, they would need more help than a single French navy that had sailed off towards the Caribbean after a few disappointing months in North America. Approached by Washington and Congress, Lafayette was charged to return to France to help reinvigorate the alliance and see if France could contribute more to the cause. Lafayette set sail from Boston, Massachusetts on January the 11th, 1779, and arrived in France at Brest on February the 6th. A new chapter was beginning as Lafayette began to wield his fame and enthusiasm in the court of Louis XVI. On arrival in France, Lafayette was transported to his father-in-law's home and held in confinement for 10 days, a symbolic punishment for having disobeyed the king's orders when he went to America. However, Louis XVI and the rest of France saw the young man as a hero, and he was celebrated throughout the kingdom. A constant stream of elites to his father-in-law's home illustrated the reality that Lafayette was no longer just a nobleman's son. He was a national celebrity and had all the world at his feet. Lafayette entered into a passionate affair with Aglaé de Nostine, one which provoked endless rounds of gossip in the French capital. Lafayette's wife, Adrienne, took the betrayal in her stride, giving Lafayette another son in December of 1779, named George Washington Lafayette. Lafayette soaked in the revelry, while also continuing to work on persuading the king and his counselors that it would be in France's best interest to send additional support to the Americans. Additional funds were to be sent, along with additional troops. However, Lafayette, much to his disappointment, was not to be in charge of the expedition. The command instead going to Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau, known in America simply as Rochambeau. Jean-Baptiste was born in Vendôme, France, in 1725. He began his military career at the age of 15 and fought in the War of Austrian Succession, a European-wide war fought over whether Maria Theresa, daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, could succeed her father as heir to the Austrian throne. The war lasted 8 years, from 1740 to 1748, and involved most of the major nations of Europe, including France, Great Britain, Sweden, the Netherlands, the Holy Roman Empire, Prussia, and Russia. During this war, Rochambeau was tutored by various prominent generals as an aide-de-camp. During the subsequent 7 Years' War, which occurred from 1756 through 1763, he not only advanced to become a general, but also gained experience fighting in the Americas. Lafayette accepted the appointment and was soon back sailing towards America, leaving France on March 9, 1780. What mattered was that the Americans succeeded, and victory should come to what Lafayette considered the brightest beacon of freedom in the world. Back in America, Lafayette was once again under the American command. Welcomed back by Washington, Lafayette served as an intermediary between the newly arrived French forces stationed in Newport, Rhode Island, and the Americans. During Lafayette's absence, the war had shifted south to the southern colonies of Georgia and South Carolina. Led by Lord Cornwallis, British forces had captured the majority of the population centers in the two states. Only through a long, protracted guerrilla warfare campaign were the two states able to maintain some American control. Meanwhile, in the New York area, Washington had his armies encamped surrounding New York, waiting for the opportune moment to strike George Clinton's forces in New York City. Washington hoped that with the arrival of the French, a victory would be soon forthcoming. However, attacking New York was low on the priorities of the French, who saw the city as too well guarded. Instead, Lafayette and the French fleet sailed towards the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia to disrupt the British operations in the area. The American turncoat Benedict Arnold had launched an invasion of the region and had succeeded in driving many Virginian planters off their plantations. Lafayette arrived in late 1780 and began leading local American forces against the better supplied and armed British army. Though constantly undersupplied, Lafayette proved to be a talented general, playing a constant game of cat and mouse with the larger British forces. Soon, Arnold's forces were joined by Lord Cornwallis's bedraggled army, who had been pursuing Nathaniel Greene's Continental soldiers. By early summer of 1781, Cornwallis and his troops had begun to fortify Yorktown, a deep-water port where larger naval vessels could dock, at the orders of his commanding officer George Clinton. Sensing a prime opportunity, American and French leaders marched troops from New York and sent a naval squadron from the Caribbean, effectively trapping Lord Cornwallis and over 7,000 British troops. The siege of Yorktown had begun. On September 28, Washington and his command of nearly 19,000 men began moving the siege lines closer to the British fortifications. Over the course of the next week, Washington's army constricted the British forces until on October 6, 1781, the Americans opened the first parallel, or trench, that would allow the Americans and French to bombard the British defenses with cannon fire. By October 9th, the American and French cannons were in position and opened fire on Yorktown. The bombardment continued until the night of October 14th, when the American and French forces launched attacks on the British outer defenses. The attacks were successful and further weakened the British. Artillery bombardment continued for 8 more days until, on October the 17th, 1781, Lord Cornwallis surrendered. Lafayette likely felt intense satisfaction at seeing his long-hated enemies subdued by the combined forces of America and France. His satisfaction undoubtedly increased as he watched Rochambeau refuse to accept the sword of Lord Cornwallis, a ritual event signaling a surrender, and instead insisted that George Washington receive the sword. When word reached towns and cities across America, celebrations were held by patriots, while loyalists feared that the worst possible scenario had come true. The war would take another 2 years to be settled as deliberations in London and Paris attempted to sort out how exactly the colonies would be separated from Great Britain. Lafayette had returned to France in 1782 in order to aid the American delegates there. In his role as advisor, Lafayette used his celebrity status to help the Americans secure the best deal possible. At the same time, Lafayette and his wife Adrienne had become favored by Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, leading to their further elevation in social circles. Lafayette soon betrayed his faithful wife again, this time pursuing Diane Adelaide de Simian, considered one of the most beautiful women in France. Lafayette, riding high, soon convinced Diane to be his mistress, once again ignoring his faithful and dedicated Adrienne, who gave birth to his daughter Virginie. This affair would last for years, though at its end, Lafayette and Diane remained friends. Despite the affair, his household remained harmonious, and visitors stopped by frequently to meet the couple. Some of the most frequent guests were Americans, who sought out the hero of the American Revolution. His home was a salon, and Lafayette was a man of letters, a product of the Enlightenment. His guests ranged from French elites, Americans, and even some Englishmen, such as William Pitt the Younger. While Lafayette remained loyal to his king, ideas were brewing in France that threatened to unleash a revolutionary storm. For the moment, however, the victory over England and the freedom of America gave Lafayette enough to focus on. He turned some of his attention to convincing his mentor and friend George Washington to come to France. However, Washington refused to leave the United States, leaving Lafayette only one option: to go back to America himself. Leaving France in July 1784, Lafayette arrived in America to find a universal welcome. For Americans, the noble Frenchman could do nothing wrong. As he toured the 13 states, impressive celebrations were held and honors bestowed on the Frenchman. He visited Washington at Mount Vernon and celebrated the growth of the United States. Though the nation had many struggles ahead of it, Lafayette was convinced the Americans could and would succeed. When Lafayette returned to France in 1785, he continued his participation in the salon culture of Paris. Forays into mesmerism, a pseudo-scientific treatment for disease, as well as supporting other scientific endeavors, were all part of his persona as a man of the Enlightenment. Throughout 1786, Lafayette toured Central and Eastern Europe, observing Prussian military operations and touring Vienna, the capital of the Austrian Empire. He wrote to numerous friends across the Atlantic, particularly George Washington, advocating for the spread of liberty and uplifting mankind. One of the projects he gave considerable energy to was the destruction of slavery. Using his own funds, he purchased lands in Guyana in South America and began a free plantation for liberated slaves. A proponent of gradual emancipation, he could little conceive how brutal the environment of his plantation was, having never visited and only directed his operations from afar. Yet he believed sincerely that slavery could be ended if leaders such as his friend George Washington took up the call to advocate for emancipation. By 1786, Lafayette was a leader and social icon, a trendsetter, had seduced the most beautiful woman in France, and was a hero of both France and America. However, this fantasy Lafayette had built for himself started to crumble in 1787. The suicide of his lover's husband caused rumors and gossip to spread in the court, many condemning Lafayette for seducing a woman who had resisted previous advances. Not only that, but political turmoil was brewing as popular discontent grew among the people over the state of the French government. A friend to the king, Lafayette was still a Republican revolutionary at heart, and the next decade would demonstrate his willingness to connect with the masses. The American Revolution had unleashed a whirlwind on Europe that would take decades to subside. Louis XVI sought to restore order and stability to the kingdom's finances and structure by calling together an assembly of notables, in essence France's parliament, which had not met in hundreds of years. Lafayette, an appointed member by the king, tirelessly called for reforms such as toleration for Protestants and tax reduction for the poor. Throughout the month of February of 1787, Lafayette and other reformers barraged fellow members with calls for a national assembly. In the end, the king called an Estates General, an assembly of representatives from the three estates or classes in the realm of France: the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners, to be held in 1789. On May 5, 1789, the Estates General gathered at Versailles, beginning the process that would be the beginning of the end for the Kingdom of France. Lafayette had been appointed a delegate for the Second Estate, the nobility. He understood that this event was historic, with the last Estates General having been called back in 1614. The French kings had ample reason to avoid calling the estates. A robust gathering of elites always had the potential to turn against the king's policies. Such a confrontation was never desirable, and it proved far easier for kings to rule without the advice of the estates than with them. Yet in this moment of crisis, as support and confidence were eroding in the monarchy, calling the estates was a last-ditch attempt at stabilizing the situation, particularly as riots and violence spread, as thousands of the lower classes found themselves starving to death. After Louis XVI opened the assembly, it quickly devolved into chaos. The Third Estate, representing the vast majority of France, demanded more equal power in the assembly. The conflict escalated until on June the 17th, the Third Estate rebelled and declared itself the National Assembly and began forming a constitution. Louis XVI attempted to intervene on June the 23rd, only to find that no one was willing to listen. Events continued to escalate until on July the 14th, crowds of protesters stormed the Bastille, the French prison and symbol of royal authority. On July the 15th, a new militia organization, the National Guard, was established by members of the Third Estate. Through it all, Lafayette's fame as a man of the people exploded. His speeches and impassioned pleas to his fellow nobles to heed the demands of the Third Estate won him many allies and equally as many enemies. Though Lafayette was a Republican, he continued to support the idea of a constitutional monarchy, one in which the king was bound by written laws. He supported the new National Guard until August, when he watched mobs kill state officials blamed for the price increases in Paris. His attempted resignation was stalled by his officers, who convinced the national hero to remain. Lafayette found himself caught between two conflicting worlds, the world supported by the aristocrats and monarchy, and that of the assembly. Lafayette would try to bridge the two worlds in ways that would satisfy neither faction. After a summer of tensions, Lafayette found himself facing another potential crisis. Diminishing supplies of bread in Paris, as well as the refusal of the king to go along with the Assembly's reforms, helped fuel a mass demonstration from the poor women of Paris. On October the 5th, 1789, a massive crowd of women marched towards Versailles, demanding the royal family accept the Assembly's reforms and come to Paris. Lafayette and his men arrived too late to stop the women's march, but decided to follow the proceedings, perhaps as an effort to maintain order. The king received delegates of the mob, in which he promised to send flower supplies to Paris. However, the gathering insisted that the king and his family return to Paris to be with the people. The next day, in the early morning hours, violence broke out as crowds flocked to Versailles, and some of the mob attacked members of the royal bodyguard. Lafayette worked furiously to calm tensions, to little avail. Lafayette suggested that the king follow the mob and return to Paris to calm tensions. Trusting Lafayette, the king agreed. One moment that riveted the crowd was when Lafayette brought Marie Antoinette to a balcony at the request of the mob. There, he kissed the queen's hand in a gesture of respect and loyalty. The crowd responded enthusiastically, seeing their hero accepting the queen. Though the mob remained on the verge of greater violence, Lafayette seemed to have a calming influence. The king and queen left for Paris on October the 7th, acceding to the crowd and setting the stage for the collapse of the French monarchy. Over the next year, tensions did not subside, but efforts were made to reorganize France's monarchy. On July the 14th, 1790, the king accepted the national constitution and the assembly, a moment which led to mass rejoicing and celebration. Lafayette himself was ecstatic. While Lafayette's popularity was at its highest, social currents were at work, undercutting the popularity of America's Frenchmen. Among royalists, Lafayette was seen as a traitor, a man who allied far too much with the mobs. Among the crowd, a growing opinion asserted that Lafayette was too much of a royalist and far too attached to the king. Lafayette found it increasingly difficult to secure obedience from his troops, and found himself further alienated from the royal family. However, Lafayette, perhaps arrogantly, believed that peace was coming to France, and with it, a better, enlightened government. His fantasy world was destroyed when the royal family attempted to flee Paris on June the 20th, 1791, only to be captured on June the 21st. Lafayette was distraught. The attempted flight undermined trust in the king among the crowds of poor Parisians, and its failure enraged aristocrats who had been planning a counter-revolution. Lafayette's reputation was declining rapidly among both groups, but the most significant damage came on July the 17th, 1791, when Lafayette's troops engaged in a heated street battle with radical revolutionaries, which resulted in over 50 killed and many more wounded. Though done to restore order, many radicals saw Lafayette's actions as a complete betrayal. This event destroyed his popularity among many poorer Parisians, who began to believe that Lafayette was, in reality, not a friend to the people. After months of tensions, Lafayette resigned his commission on October the 8th, 1791. He was 34 years old, and now hated by both parties. Lafayette returned home to Auvergne, hoping to reset his career. Back home, Lafayette found that the local nobles were uninterested in interacting with him, though many peasants saw him as a hero. His few supporters in Paris attempted to have Lafayette made mayor, but he lost in a humiliating manner. However, his friends in the National Guard insisted that Lafayette be selected as one of the 3 commanders of France's army. In this, he was opposed by radicals from the left, who sought to use the army to their advantage. Lafayette continued to vocally support the king, which won him only more anger from the radical leftists in the assembly, many of whom were part of the Jacobin Club, a far-left political party that sought to destabilize and overthrow the monarchy. In 1792, further protests and riots in Paris broke out, the power of the king shrinking with each disturbance. As the king became increasingly unpopular, so did his defender Lafayette, On the 10th of August 1792, a riot ransacked the king's palace in Paris, which forced the royal family to seek the protection of the National Assembly. The image of absolute monarchy, or even a strong constitutional monarchy, was broken. Derided by Jacobins as an agent of foreign powers, specifically the Austrians, Lafayette attempted to shore up support for the king by demanding his troops swear loyalty to the nation, the law, and the king. Few followed his commands, and he was released from his command on the 17th of August 1792, and on the 19th of August his arrest was ordered. On the 19th of August, Lafayette and 22 other officers fled to the town of Rochefort, a town under Austrian control. Rather than be allowed passage to a neutral nation as Lafayette had hoped, he and his comrades were arrested and treated as prisoners of war. While Lafayette languished in prison, the French won a resounding victory on the 20th of September 1792 over the Prussian Empire, thus ending any outside attempts to restore Louis XVI as King of France. The following day, the First French Republic was proclaimed to rejoicing among the crowds of Paris. While Lafayette remained in prison, the new regime seized Lafayette's property and mocked the former hero. Meanwhile, the rulers of Austria and Prussia took their anger out on a man they believed had been responsible for the fall of France's monarchy. Lafayette was tortured, deprived of air and light, given meager, dirty rations, and subjected to brutal guards. Not only this, but Lafayette learned of the execution of the royal family, the beginning of what became known as the Terror, a brutal period of government-sponsored mass execution of political enemies and the arrest of his wife. He would also learn that many of his wife's family had been murdered by the new republic. After gaining her freedom, Adrienne chose to come to the prison that held Lafayette and suffered with him. It was a brutal period, both for Lafayette and the French people. Many of his former friends, his enemies and compatriots, were victims of the guillotine. After 4 years languishing in jail, George Washington, now President of the United States, sought to aid his friend. Though the United States was a young and a relatively powerless nation, the networks that Americans in Europe had built proved to be essential in securing Lafayette's release. Through these networks, France's new ruler Napoleon Bonaparte was able to force the issue. In order to save face, the Austrian government released Lafayette and his family on the 19th of September 1797, declaring that they had done so only at the request of the Americans and through their own generosity. Though freed, Lafayette understood he would be unable to return to France, and instead stayed in Hamburg, in what is today Germany, with his wife's aunt, the Madame de Tessé. The stay in Hamburg was punctuated by a near-continual stream of visitors seeking the former general. Lafayette moved the family to a personal estate, and then to Holland in 1798, but in the process nearly wiped out the family fortune. His wife, Adrienne, continually plied her networks in the French government to receive permission for Lafayette to return to France. However, her husband's vocal criticism of the French Republic, especially the leadership of the nation, made her work far more difficult. Lafayette, never a particularly patient man, forced the issue in November of 1799 when he entered France under a false name and traveled to Paris. When he was discovered, Napoleon was livid. However, he permitted Lafayette to stay if he avoided attracting attention. The former French hero acquiesced, and the Lafayette family, at long last, returned to France. The nation had changed immensely over the 7-year absence of Lafayette. The Republic had bled so much of its strength in internal strife, and in the near-constant wars with its neighbors. From the ruins of the 1790s, emerged one of the most powerful leaders in the history of modern Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. Lafayette had a grudging admiration for the soldier from Corsica. Though he disliked his attacks on the liberal order and the distancing of France from the United States, he knew that it was Napoleon who had saved him and his family from a life in an Austrian prison. Bonaparte knew that Lafayette had the potential to be a problem to his rule. Rather than destroy Lafayette, Bonaparte sought to use him and intertwine him into the web of his followers. However, Lafayette continued to decry what he felt were Bonaparte's attacks on French liberty, a tactic that earned him little favor with the most powerful man in France. Still, Napoleon continued to offer Lafayette positions within his government, all of which Lafayette refused, eventually instigating a vendetta against the Lafayette family. Lafayette's son George Washington and his son-in-law Louis de Lasteyrie both served with distinction in the emperor's armies, however were unable to rise in status despite their valiance and heroics. Eventually, the two young men withdrew from the army. Meanwhile, Lafayette continued to avoid public life and retired at his wife's chateau, La Grange. Here, throughout the early 1800s, Lafayette entertained guests and friends, welcoming them to what could have been described as a salon, a place where ideas and questions were freely shared and discussed. It was during this period that his wife Adrienne died from complications caused by her time in prison with her husband. Her death on the 24th of December 1807 left a void that no other could fill. 7 years under Napoleon's rule did little to change Lafayette's life. He avoided public debates and continued to receive guests at his home, all the while experimenting with farming techniques on his land. But the defeat of Napoleon and his exile in 1814 changed the course of France once again. The restoration of the royal family under the leadership of Louis XVIII was a time of reflection for France and for Lafayette. Had the past 30 years been meaningless? Lafayette welcomed the monarchy's return, so long as liberty was ensured for the people. However, his position remained compromised at the court as many royalists refused to forgive him for the role he played in destroying the royal family during the days leading up to the founding of the First French Republic. The restoration of the Bourbon monarchy was short-lived, as Napoleon escaped from the Isle of Elba, where he had been exiled, and reinstated himself as ruler of France in early 1815. The royal family once again fled, and Napoleon began the project of winning the hearts of the people and driving out foreign powers from French soil. Napoleon once again attempted to woo Lafayette, but to no avail. Lafayette instead sought a seat in the Chamber of Representatives of France. Elected on the 8th of May 1815, Lafayette believed that his involvement could once again help shape the nation, bringing it closer to the ideals he had believed in since he first went to fight in the American Revolution. After the Battle of Waterloo on the 20th of June 1815, Lafayette moved quickly against Napoleon, using his position in the Assembly to declare the body to be in permanent session and declare any actions against it high treason. Napoleon, who had begun to try to undermine the Assembly, was forced to abdicate on the 22nd of June 1815. Lafayette had helped to strike the fatal blow against Napoleon's ambition, thus making him one of Napoleon's bitterest enemies. Soon after the fall of Napoleon, Louis XVIII and his allies quickly maneuvered to displace Lafayette and other assemblymen from places of power. Lafayette once again returned to his country estate to watch as political forces engulfed France once again. For many, Lafayette was a living symbol of opposition to the monarchy, and the king understood this clearly. Hatred for Lafayette among royalists reached new heights as they saw him elected to the Assembly in 1819 and become the voice of the opposition to the Royalist Party. They couldn't understand how Lafayette could ignore decades of bloodshed and even the death of his family. For them, republicanism symbolized destabilization and mob rule. Thus, Lafayette's support was a tacit support in their minds for the Terror. From 1815 to 1820, France became more stridently royalist, as counter-revolutionaries, led by many former aristocrats, worked to destroy the effects of the French Revolution entirely. Lafayette remained a thorn in their side, forever fighting any attempts at restoring the old ways of the French monarchy. Lafayette was fighting a losing battle, and in February of 1822, he aligned himself with an underground operation seeking to overthrow the government and establish a republic once again, this time with Lafayette at the head. The revolt was a miserable failure, and Lafayette was lucky to have destroyed the evidence that linked him to the planned uprising. He worked to save the men captured, though to no avail. 4 men, lowly non-commissioned officers, were executed on the 21st of September 1822. The failure of the uprising led Lafayette back to the limited role of assemblyman, where he continued to fight and berate the French monarchy for failing to keep its promises to protect liberty in the French nation. Lafayette, however, was defeated on the 24th of February 1824 by a conservative opponent. Cut out of the realm of politics, Lafayette decided it was time to journey to America and tour his second homeland once again. Lafayette arrived in America in the August of 1824 and was immediately given a hero's welcome. While his reputation had suffered much in Europe among both liberals and conservatives, in America, all welcomed the hero of the Revolution. His arrival united Americans and elicited widespread celebration and adoration. He visited over 100 cities, his presence bringing out the best the city or town had to offer. Lafayette also visited old friends, such as Thomas Jefferson, during his travels through the United States. In December, Lafayette visited the capital, Washington, D.C., where he was warmly received by Congress and the President James Monroe. Lafayette was the hero to all, and his travels across the nation only evoked greater celebration. After a year of touring, Lafayette bade farewell to his adopted nation, leaving the United States in September of 1825. For many Americans, meeting Lafayette was near sacred, as he represented the last of the founding generation of the United States. Lafayette took the celebration in his stride, refusing gifts he thought too extreme, but always showing love to the people. He departed with soil from the United States to place on his tomb. Now in his 60s and using a cane, Lafayette knew his life was nearing its final chapter. Upon arrival in France, Lafayette returned to hostility and suspicion. Royalists rightly believed Lafayette wanted the demise of the royal control of the nation, and had been monitoring his estate with renewed vigor. However, they faced a man who had been renewed by a year in America, and was more determined than ever to help liberate his beloved France. A new monarch, Charles X, had ascended to the throne. Charles respected Lafayette. However, Lafayette knew that Charles was deeply committed to absolutism, something Lafayette himself abhorred. Lafayette regained his seat in the Assembly in June of 1827. Immediately, the old Frenchman launched his offensive against the monarchy and its royalist supporters. Speeches constantly pressed against the maneuverings of Charles X and his court. Lafayette once again proposed universal suffrage, only to find that the court, particularly Charles X, refused to comply. As Lafayette galvanized the opposition, Charles X made a costly mistake in July of 1830, when he looked to suspend the freedom of the press and dissolve the assembly. This action once again set off another revolution. After soldiers fired on protesters on the 27th of July, Lafayette determined to come to Paris and head the revolution. His old fire had not abated, and his willingness to fight monarchy was at an all-time high. Lafayette was placed at the head of the newly reconstituted National Guard, or the Citizens' Army. At 73, he was willing and ready to fight. However, unwilling to himself take leadership of the country, he instead endorsed the Duke of Orléans, Louis Philippe, as a constitutional monarch. On the 31st of July, in front of an anxious crowd, Lafayette made public his support by bringing the Duke to the balcony of the building in which Lafayette was staying, and in front of the crowd made a display of placing the French flag around the shoulders of the Duke. Lafayette hoped that the assurances of the Duke and the Duke's supporters that liberty would be protected would prove to be accurate. He was wrong, once again. Appointed as the head of the National Guard under Louis Philippe's regime, Lafayette quickly became a thorn in the side of the new monarch. Constantly agitating for more changes, Lafayette could not help but lead opposition to the old order. The king, however, wanted some of the past to remain and worked to curb Lafayette. He did so in December of 1830 by making Lafayette's authority in the National Guard limited to the city of Paris, a blow to Lafayette's power. Undeterred, Lafayette resumed his opposition in the Assembly, castigating and fighting the new regime at every turn. However, he was wary of leading open violent opposition, such as on the 6th of June 1832, when his friend General Lamarck was buried. The crowd sought to use the body as a symbol of opposition, but Lafayette refused to encourage the revolutionary spirit of the people. In the end, Lafayette left the city, only to learn that an uprising following the funeral had been brutally crushed. For the remaining 2 years of his life, Lafayette continued to fight against Louis Philippe, constantly declaring his condemnation of the government. Filled with fire, Lafayette refused to lay down the weapon of his tongue in defending the rights of the French people. However, his health was in decline, and on the 20th of May 1834, the hero of both the American and French revolutions died. Lafayette's death was mourned by thousands in France and across the world. Many saw the stubborn Frenchman as a symbol of freedom, a relic of the age of revolution when the world had turned upside down as revolution rocked societies to their core. His work was one of democracy and republicanism. Many saw him as a living standard of the ideals of a new age. However, he was also castigated for what many saw as naivety. In 1789, he had consorted with men who soon bathed France in the blood of their political opponents. Lafayette constantly agitated for freedom, which more than once ended in more deaths and violence. To this day, Lafayette's legacy in France remains mixed. However, for the vast majority in America, he has remained a hero and a true founding father, even till the present. What do you think of the Marquis de Lafayette? Was he a true hero, or was he actually a man who was naive and obsessed with revolution? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.